Don Bradley is an author and independent historian specializing in the beginnings of Latter-day Saint restoration. He completed a bachelor's in history at BYU and a master's in history at Utah State. His thesis that he wrote for that is American Proto-Zionism and the Book of Lehi, Recontextualizing the Rise of Mormonism. I'm sure you've all read it. Yeah. If not, I'm sorry, that's pathetic. I barely said it right, let alone ever read it. Don has performed an internship with the Joseph Smith Papers Project, working with some of the earliest Joseph Smith sources. He was the primary researcher for Brian Hale's Joseph Smith's Polygamy series. I think there's 4 books in that series. Very important as well. He has published on the translation of the Book of Mormon, Plural Marriage Before Nauvoo, Joseph Smith's Grand Fundamental Principles of Mormonism, and the Kinderhook Plates, and has forthcoming works on the Kinderhook Plates and the First Vision. And of course, this year, as you know, this is the bicentennial of Joseph Smith's First Vision. So I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting things to come on that subject, including what we heard the next General Conference. With that, I would now like to turn the time over to Don Bradley. A pocket. Let's give it a try.
Okay, testing. Can you hear me?
Jim? No? How can you shake your head no that you can't hear? That's what I no. Okay, we're going to see if we can ratchet this up a little bit. And can we do the volume a little bit? That might help. Let's try that.
Try now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I can sure hear me. Hello, thanks, Kurt. So I am hoping that that tour of the safe room includes looking at the lost pages.
Possibly.
Possibly, okay. We'll see. One of the, when I first started writing this book, one of the questions I got from someone in my ward, actually my Elders Quorum president at the time, when I said, I'm writing a book on the lost 116 pages of the Book of Mormon, he said, wouldn't that be a very short book? And now, several hundred pages of writing later that had to be condensed into a 320-page book, I have the definitive answer to my Elders Quorum president's question. No, in fact, that wouldn't be a very short book. So how can this be, right? How can you write a book about a book that's missing? How can you write a book about a missing source? And you know, in some ways that I gotten that question from a number of people. In some ways, the question I think is sometimes asked kind of naively because people don't necessarily know about other scholarly attempts to write about a lost book. So we have this with the Bible. We've got missing sources there. We've got the Q source that stands behind some of the Gospels, right? We've got the various strands of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses that scholars hypothesize, right? And that are missing to us. Like, we don't know for sure what those texts said or the boundaries. We have to figure it out. So we have a tradition of a couple hundred years in biblical studies of figuring out missing texts. We also have other examples of people reconstructing works that were lost that I will go into. But I want to say that, you know, from another angle, this question of, you know, how can you write a book about a lost book, it's a really good question, right? Because even in those cases where scholars have been reconstructing other missing texts, there has to be a rigorous methodology. It's not obvious how you say what was in a missing text. And so tonight, what I want to talk with you about is the challenge of reconstructing a lost text, and go over a little bit of the history of this project for me personally, and then what are some of the methods that I've employed in reconstructing a lost text, and some examples of how that textual reconstruction works, some specifics. So, an important thing to address here is the why, right? So why write a book about the lost 116 pages? Evidently, given that this book was lost nearly 200 years ago and nobody's done it before, evidently it's not an obvious thing to write a book about. So the personal backstory of this, for me, goes back to primary, actually. I remember being 10 years old, South Bend, Indiana ward, and my primary teacher, Mike Standiford, taught us the story of Joseph Smith lending the manuscript to Martin Harris, and that manuscript never coming back. And I remember thinking, I probably asked it out, I remember thinking it, I probably, knowing me, asked it out loud, and I must, whatever the answer was, I must not have gotten a good one because I don't remember the answer. But I remember asking, we're missing part of the Book of Mormon? Like, what was in it, right? I mean, the Book of Mormon is so foundational to Latter-day Saint faith. So if you grow up a Latter-day Saint, like what do you hear more about than the Book of Mormon, right? Like what's more foundational for you? And so the idea that part of it was gone and nobody seemed to know what was in it was strange to me. And I think that whatever in life, whatever we experience over and over becomes normal to us. We get used to it, right? So you look at different cultures around the world, and from our vantage point, sometimes their cultural practices might be really strange, right? But the people in those cultures, the people who've grown up in those cultures, not strange to them, right? Because it's normal. This is something they've experienced repeatedly. So we have gotten used to the fact that part of the Book of Mormon is missing. And so that has maybe ceased to be as weird to us as it should be. So my first motive behind this, part of the why, was just curiosity about what was in that lost text. As an adult, I added a new motive alongside curiosity about what was missing. In researching the Book of Mormon, studying the Book of Mormon, one of the things that I saw was that in Mormon's abridgment, he would frequently allude back to earlier events. He would frequently allude back to, it was like I didn't really see this till I read closely. But when I read closely, what I would see is that Mormon was developing certain themes across his narration, and that in order to understand what he's saying, let's say at the end of Alma, you need the context of the other things that have happened in Alma, and you need the context of what happened at the beginning of Alma, and not just both just to understand the flow of the narrative, but also to understand how he's developing certain themes, how he's echoing things that he had said earlier. And I came to a kind of horrifying realization because I kept sort of chaining back things that Mormon said. I'd go back earlier in his writings and earlier to trace through the system of internal allusions and echoes that he's creating. And then I got to this wall, the lost pages, right? So we've all heard the lost pages referred to as the Book of Lehi, and with reason, because Joseph Smith used this term to refer to the text. And I actually talk about the why behind that in chapter 5 of the book. But because of that, many of us have had the impression that the Book of Mormon's lost pages were just a variant story of Lehi, It's just a more detailed version of Lehi's narrative. Now, it was a more detailed version of Lehi's narrative, for sure, but the lost pages were told by Joseph Smith in the preface to the 1830 Book of Mormon and by section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The lost pages were replaced by the small plates. The small plates covered the same time period as the lost pages. So lost pages then, like the small plates, covered from Lehi and his exodus from Jerusalem down to the reign of King Benjamin, the early reign of Benjamin. So when people have calculated the chronology for this, like the LDS Scripture Committee, the people who did the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, and so on, they've calculated the relevant time period here to be about 450, 460 years. So unless Lehi lived a really long time, it's more than just a missing story of Lehi. So we've got, in fact, I eventually came to realize just what proportion of Mormon's abridgment this is. Okay, so Book of Mormon, of course, says it starts 600 years before Christ with Lehi in Jerusalem. Then, Christ, the Lehite Nephite calendar is restarted with the birth of Christ. And then, there's Christ coming, and there's 200 years of peace, and so on. So at the end of 4th Nephi, the last record keeper before Mormon, a record keeper named Amaron, writes his final things on the record, and then he buries the record in a hill, and he leaves it for a successor. And so he tells Mormon, when Mormon's about 10 years old, someday you're going to go unbury this record, and you're going to create a record of your own life. So this tells us Mormon's abridgment, right? So Mormon does an abridgment of everybody up before him from Lehi all the way through Amaron. Then Mormon picks up with not an abridgment, but a first-person account of what happened in his lifetime. So how long is the period of Mormon's abridgment? What's the 600 years from Lehi to the birth of Christ, and then the 320 years from the birth of Christ to the time that Amaron buries the plates. 600 plus 320, yes, I do math as well. It's 920 years. So how long was it that I mentioned that people have calculated the missing part of Mormon's abridgment to be? It's the first 450 or 460 years. 920 divided by 2 is 460. We are literally missing the first half of Mormon's abridgment. The first half. So this is fascinating. It's also kind of appalling. Like, how can we understand this text when we're missing so much of it, right? Like, so your challenge tonight is to take any one of these books sitting by you that you've never read before, right? Rip out the first half. I think you'll have to pay for it first. Rip out the first half, okay? And then have somebody else give you a thumbnail sketch of that first half, and then you read the second half and see how much sense does it make not having the first half. That's the situation we're in with Mormon's abridgment. That's why I did this project, right? That was the thing that was motivating me. I wanted to know what was in the lost pages of Mormon's abridgment so I could understand what was in the part of Mormon's abridgment we still had. So that took it from just curiosity, right? Curiosity about what was lost was now combined with really wanting to understand what we still have. And so then with the why in place here, what about the how? Like, that's great, right, to want to understand this, but how in the world do we do this? How do we figure out what was in a missing text? So I didn't know where to start either. I didn't know where to start, right? I didn't, although there have been, as I'll get to further in just a minute, there have been a number of attempts across centuries to reconstruct missing texts. Most of those efforts were unknown to me at the time, 15 years ago, when I started this project. I was aware of some of the biblical efforts, but not really much beyond that. And those are different also in a way that I will explain. I had to develop a methodology of my own. And then later, when I was working on my master's, I did part of my master's thesis on the same topic. And so I actually studied out, as part of that process, other examples of people reconstructing missing texts and tried to find out what were the methods that were employed. And one of the, it's taken some work actually for me to learn to really describe my methods very well, because I kind of made them up, like they came gradually, right? And partly there was a real logic to them, but there was also a measure of sort of intuition and how I was developing them. So when I was having a challenge in my master's thesis, laying out in the introduction, laying out my methodology, and I was looking at what other scholars had written about the methodology for this, one of the authors said, it's difficult to describe the method without showing it in practice. And I thought, bingo, because that's exactly the problem that I was having in my thesis was, how do I explain this method without actually just doing the work, right? And so I've figured out ways of explaining it more precisely and giving some examples. But a sort of general analogy or metaphor will help here to start with. And then I'll get into other examples of textual reconstruction, and then my own methods, and then examples of putting it into practice. The analogy would be a picture puzzle. Okay, let's say you've got a giant picture puzzle, and you're out in Kansas, right? And a tornado whips through, destroys the house, blows everything away, and you are later on you're sort of recollecting your various belongings, and you realize that this picture puzzle that you'd gotten but never put together is mostly gone. And you scrape together the remaining pieces, right? And let's say out of a giant 5,000 piece picture puzzle, you've got 750 pieces that you can collect together. And you start to piece those together, whatever ones you can make fit. And at first, who knows what you're going to find here. But as you start getting some of those pieces to fit, a picture starts to emerge. You can start to see part of what that picture was. And that's kind of what we've got with the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, unless or until the manuscript is found, if it exists. So we can't know everything that was in it. But we've got enough clues from different sources that we can start to piece together what was there. And when we do, we can start to see a picture, and then that picture in turn can provide more guidance for where the other pieces might go. So the history of textual reconstruction. So I mentioned the cases with biblical texts that are missing. There's a rich sort of, I'm using the word loosely here, but science really of textual criticism that tries to reconstruct the earliest version of a text, and in this case that includes missing texts like Q. So what Q is Mark was the earliest gospel, and Matthew and Luke both used Mark. Matthew and Luke have a common core of material, though, between them that's not in Mark. So scholars have called that source Q. And in German, Quelle, if I'm saying that right. This source can be sort of teased out by comparing Matthew and Luke and seeing what do they share in common. So that has an analogy here with the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, in that these scholars are reconstructing a missing text. There are also differences. One of the differences is that it would be exceedingly difficult to reconstruct the exact words of the lost pages. There's only one instance where I'm quite convinced that I know what the exact phrase used was, and this has to do with Lehi's calling vision at the beginning of the book of Lehi. There are phrase echoes in our available Book of Mormon text, so I think I can identify the exact phrase there. But for the most part, we're not trying to reconstruct phrases here, exact text. We're trying to reconstruct narratives. This is the bigger picture. But another difference actually is one that favors the reconstruction of the lost pages, because the Q source in New Testament studies is a hypothetical text. Nobody's actually certain. There are no ancient sources that talk about this text. People aren't certain that the text existed. It's also possible that either Matthew or Luke had the other's gospel available to him and used that, in which case there wouldn't be any Q. So whereas those biblical sources are hypothetical, the lost pages of the Book of Mormon were for certain a tangible object. We have the accounts from scribes who wrote down these words. We have people who held this manuscript, who read this manuscript, who talk about the theft. So here we are not reconstructing a hypothetical text. We're reconstructing, for sure, a historical text. Outside of biblical studies, there have been attempts since the medieval period within Islamic studies to reconstruct certain Islamic texts, and there's literature about these texts and the efforts to reconstruct them based on later accounts that quote from them or that describe them. In China, I believe it was the early 1700s, one of the emperors commissioned a number of scholars to attempt to reconstruct a monumental earlier Chinese work that's known as the Great Yongle Encyclopedia. One of my professors at Utah State that I consulted with as I was doing the master's thesis version of this work, Mark Damon, he does the reconstruction of ancient Greek and Roman texts. That's his primary scholarly work. He is a historian of ancient theater. And so when I asked him about methodology, I was very gratified to find that the methods that I had hit on in my work were actually very similar to some of the methods that he had hit on in his work. And to understand the work of reconstruction, one of the necessary things is to know what resources are available for the work of reconstruction. Like, what are the sources, right? We've got to start from something here. And so really step one for me in my process was gathering together everything that had been written on the subject at that time, which at the time you could fit in a thimble. There was one real paper, brief but good paper, that John Fetness had written, and otherwise just little scattered couple page things in various books. And then gathering the known sources or whatever, or unknown sources, sources that I could find or identify. Most notably, well, there are several. Most obviously, let's say, the extant text of the Book of Mormon, the part that we have. So I've already mentioned that what prompted me to do this work was that the available text of Mormon's abridgment is often alluding back to earlier events, sometimes from that lost text. Well, that gives us clues right there. So the very questions, the very texts that were prompting me to explore what was in the lost pages, some of those are actually useful in understanding what was in the lost pages. And hey, Marie, I just saw you. In this work, actually, a friend did an enormous amount of research for me that I would be remiss to not call out. Thank you, Marie Thatcher. For instance, the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, the lost manuscript, like I said, covered the same time period as the small plates. Then Joseph Smith picked up the translation from there at Mosiah chapter 1. So just a little bit into that new translation work after the lost manuscript. In Mosiah chapter 11, there's mention of an incident that we are apparently supposed to be familiar with. So it says there that King Noah built a tower on top of the hill that was north of the land Shiloh. And it says, and it was the same hill that the children of Nephi, used as a resort at the time they fled out of the land. So you guys remember, right, when the children of Nephi fled out of the land to this hill? Because I don't, right? It's not in our extant text, but our narrator here is mentioning it in a way that shows we're supposed to know this story. Well, given that the only way we could know what that event had been would be if Mormon had told us about the event. He must have told it to us, otherwise he'd be explaining it here and not just referring back to it as something we already know. So even though that creates, on the one hand, a mystery, well, what was this event, right? What was the context? What was going on here? It also gives us a clue to the event. We wouldn't even know there had been that event if Mormon weren't alluding back to it. But since he did, we now know, okay, the children of Nephi were fleeing out of the land. So, it raises the question of which land, what's the context, right? On their way out, on this sort of exodus that they're making, they stop at this particular hill as a place of refuge. So another example of this would be Alma chapter 10, verse 2, where Amulek is giving his genealogy, and he says he's a descendant of Aminadai who interpreted the writing that was written on the wall of the temple by the finger of God, and doesn't explain any further about this, but it's familiar to the people he's talking to, and is apparently supposed to be familiar to us because no explanation is given. So this is another clue to what had been in those lost pages. So one of our types of sources is narrative callbacks, where our narrator is echoing something he's told us previously, but that we don't still have. Another one of the types of sources that we have, or another source, is the small plates. Because the small plates cover that same time period, albeit in very condensed form, right? The thumbnail sketch version, it tells us something, right? It gives us at least a skeletal narrative of that first 4.5 centuries of Nephite history. So we can take that skeletal narrative and by close reading, by using other sources in the Book of Mormon and outside the Book of Mormon, we can put some flesh on those bones, right? We can flesh out some of these missing narratives. My other sources, Joseph had some early revelations that refer back to things that were in the lost pages. Section 10 does this explicitly. Sections 3 and 5 in the earliest manuscripts did this as well. But because the ways that they were echoing when they were echoing the lost manuscript, Joseph Smith, Martin Harris would have recognized those echoes. When the revelations are published, nobody else is going to recognize those allusions to the lost manuscript, so they were removed from the text, but they can be identified in those early revelations. That's another category of sources that we've got. And then we've got other external statements that people made, both general statements about sort of the flavor of the Book of Mormon text during this period and how Hebraic it was, and then specific narratives or narrative details that they give. So one example here would be a source that I basically practically tripped and fell over at the church archives. I was looking for something else, but I'd already started this project. I was looking through meeting minutes for the Utah Stake Conference, Stake, down in Provo, and I was looking at the meeting minutes for April 6, 1856. Emer Harris, brother of Martin Harris, ancestor of Dallin Harris Oaks, if you didn't know what the H stands for. Emer Harris gave a history of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and told things about the lost pages. He told something about the length. He placed them as longer than 116 pages. And he said some things about how Mulek escaped from the Babylonians. That's not in our Book of Mormon text, and said this was from the lost pages, which his family had had possession of and which he may have actually seen himself. Martin was showing it to family members. Emer Harris lived in the area. He may have actually been one who handled those pages. My favorite source of this category is an 1830 interview that a Palmyra neighbor of the Smiths, young man at the time, Fayette Latham, did. So the Book of Mormon was at press, but there was buzz in Palmyra about it, but people couldn't get their hands on it yet. They couldn't actually read it. So Fayette Latham and his cousin, they did exactly what I would have done. They went to the Smith home, right? Knocked on the door, and they got a lengthy recitation from Joseph Smith Sr. about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon with details that we can verify from other sources, and fascinating account. And then he gave a narrative of the Book of Mormon. And the narrative that he gave, it's very brief comparatively, but as he talks about Lehi and Lehi's exodus and the quest for the brass plates and so on, he's giving a familiar narrative with some obvious garblings where you can see how he made a mistake, right? He thinks that the Liahona, he knows that they're guided by this ball, right? And he talks about that. His understanding from what Joseph Smith Sr. said was not that the ball acted as a compass. He assumed that the ball was floating in the air in front of them, right? So it'd be like the pillar of cloud guiding the Israelites on their biblical exodus. So he gives details of stories of the Book of Mormon that are not evident garblings of what's there, but are not in our text, things that would fit beautifully. He places the Lehi's exodus in a Jewish festival setting, which I argue in one of my chapters, chapter 7, we can identify as the festival of Passover, which then reframes that whole early narrative of Lehi's deliverance and shows that it's a sort of typological narrative that's illustrating the deliverance of humankind by the Messianic Lamb of God. It reframes Lehi's own direct teachings about the Lamb of God. His revelations about this were given during Passover. Joseph Smith Sr. gives other narratives that answer questions that scholars have identified as being raised by our Book of Mormon text, but not answered by that text. So, for instance, Joseph Smith Sr. gives a narrative of how the Nephites get the interpreters. Mm-hmm. So our Book of Mormon text tells us the brother of Jared got the interpreters from the Lord. Then later, we see that certain Nephite kings have the interpreters, going back apparently to Mosiah I in the Lost Pages, but we're never given a narrative of it. Why? It's a narrative that was in the Lost Pages. Joseph Smith Sr. relates details of that narrative. We can show how those details fit the narrative that we have. So these are examples of the kinds of sources that we have. So then how then do we take the sources and flesh out what was in the text. So one of the examples, one example of methodology that I use in this work of reconstruction, and that Dr. Damon told me he uses also in his work of reconstructing Greek and Roman plays, is looking at the larger structure. Actually, I thought I had another page. I may just need to... Oh, here we go. Okay. So I've already mentioned looking for narrative callbacks. Another line of reconstruction that I use and that Dr. Damon had used is identifying larger narrative structures and then using those structures to project what happened next, or as schemas for putting in new data points. So in these Greek plays, you would have a playwright, I think it was Menander, for instance, whose work, he models his work on certain earlier playwrights. So we know that a particular play of his that's mostly missing was supposed to have been modeled on a certain earlier play. We know what the structure of that play was. Then we have fragments of his play. We can use that to help us project, what filled in the gaps in his play. What was he pulling on structurally here? We've also got other texts that then, by other playwrights, that echo his structures. So we have this, Book of Mormon narrative tends to be typological. So it often builds on the sort of typological framework of biblical narrative. So maybe the most obvious example of this would be the Exodus theme. There are several excellent papers that have been written across time about the various journeys, narratives of journey in the Book of Mormon as exoduses, and particularly the narrative that it all starts with, the narrative of Lehi's Exodus. So Lehi is a Moses figure. His story begins with he's on some sort of journey, he's going forth, and there's a pillar of fire that comes down and rests on a rock in front of him. So he experiences the divine presence in a pillar of fire. Well, where's that language from? Where's that imagery from? Pillar of fire. It's biblical. It's the Exodus. It's Moses, right? So Moses has his calling at a burning bush on Sinai, and then he leads the children of Israel through the wilderness, and they're guided by a pillar of fire that also can become a pillar of cloud. And so you've got starting there and then running through various aspects of Lehi's narrative, including this part that I was talking about of a Passover context to his Exodus. When do the Israelites actually leave Egypt? They leave Egypt at Passover. The first Passover was the event that enabled them to finally leave captivity and go toward their promised land. So our Book of Mormon text gives us enough detail that we can see the Exodus structure there. So then when these other sources, these early Joseph Smith revelations, these accounts from Joseph Smith Sr., from a couple statements from Joseph Smith actually, from people who knew Martin Harris, when they give more details, we can plug those details in to this larger framework of a story of Exodus that's built on the same typology as the Exodus narrative of the Bible. So one of the big things to look at in figuring out these sources then is intertextuality. Looking for where is Mormon echoing his own previous narratives, where is the Book of Mormon narrative echoing the Bible, and so on. So an example of where this becomes relevant is that verse that I mentioned earlier in Alma, where Aminadi is interpreting the writing which was on the wall of the temple. written by the finger of God. Well, the theme of a supernatural finger writing on the wall, that's a familiar theme. That's in the book of Daniel. And there was a warning that was being given that Daniel then, like the king and his wise man can't interpret this writing, but a prophet inspired by God, a wisdom figure, Daniel, can interpret this writing by God's power. You've got, not with exact writing on the wall, but you've got a similar theme played out in the story of Joseph in Egypt with Pharaoh's dream. You've got, this idea of writing by the finger of God. Well, what's written by the finger of God? The Ten Commandments on Sinai during the Exodus. So this little snippet of narrative, or little summary of narrative in Alma 10:2 gives things that it is drawing on its echoing biblical narratives that we can identify, and these in turn can help us to understand, by understanding the typology that it's building on, we can potentially flesh out more of what this event was and what was the meaning of the event. Why is God writing on the wall of the temple? Why is he writing specifically with his finger? And there are other texts then in the Book of Mormon, texts that we have that we can connect this narrative with to make more sense of that context. In fact, one of the things that we can do with that actually is we can look, since Amulek gives Amminadai as one of his ancestors, and he tells us roughly, he gives us an idea of how many generations back Amminadai was. We can use that to project back what's the setting in which this narrative would have taken place. So, for instance, what temple are we talking about? Well, if you look at how far back you had to go in those generations, it would be the temple of Nephi, before the original Nephite nation in the land of Nephi is destroyed and that temple is destroyed. Mosiah the First leads the people on an exodus to Zarahemla. So then we can further take what's in the small plates and look for the context in which this event would have occurred. And so I've actually got a whole chapter that fleshes out this narrative, connecting it with the destructions of the year 320 in the book of Omni. Another example would be the hill north of Shiloh that I mentioned. We can connect, even though in Mosiah 11 it's very vague, right? It doesn't give us a specific thing to tie this to, like when the children of Nephi are fleeing out of the land, what's going on there. But actually the exact same phrasing, if we look for intertextuality, or the exact same phrasing of the Nephites fleeing out of the land is used in the book of Omni to describe Mosiah the First's exodus from the land of Nephi to the land of Zarahemla. So with that, and then we can look at the the geography of Book of Mormon events, where this hill was located. It turns out it's a place that people are stopping as they're traveling between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla. So it would make sense as a stopping point on Mosiah the First's exodus. So drawing connections between texts is one of the important aspects of method. Another one that I'll mention is in Joseph Smith Sr.'s narrative of the Book of Mormon that he gives to Fayette Latham. He says that when Lehi's group arrived in their new promised land, that they sent out spies to look at the land, like scouts, right? And this actually echoes a biblical narrative, again, which gives us more clues of what's going on. when the biblical Israelites conclude their exodus and arrive in their promised land, they send out spies. Moses sends spies to scout out the land, and this is the beginning of the conquest. And so this gives us a hint. This and other aspects of this Joseph Smith Sr. narrative give us hints that not only was there an Exodus narrative in the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, there was also a sort of conquest narrative. And it's, yeah, I'll stop there on that. Well, actually, no, I'll throw in one more thing. So since a conquest narrative, like an Exodus narrative, is, this is a major framework, right? Then when we find additional details, we can see how those details fit in with that larger narrative. So one of these details is that a close associate of Martin Harris, who was kind of milking him for information about what was in the lost pages, says that Nephi's sword, the sword of Laban, had previously been the sword of Joshua, that Joshua had used in the conquest, says that Laban was a descendant of Joshua. So Nephi talks about, in the New World, dealing with the Lamanites in their new promised land, that he wields the sword of Laban in defense of his people. This is giving us a sort of quote-unquote context and conquest narrative as its context. And so this detail of a sword of Joshua appearing in the narrative has a place that it fits. The upshot of all this is that the Book of Mormon narrative comes out much more clearly as we look at the how the various narratives come together of Lehi and Nephi in the lost pages. We can see larger patterns where there's an exodus, there's a conquest, there's the founding of a sacred dynasty, there's the building of a temple. These are all events that happened in ancient Israel. And here we have the Nephites acting as a new Israel, Lehi and Nephi building a new Israelite nation on the model of the story of biblical Israel in the Hebrew Bible. And so as we figure out more, piece together from these puzzle pieces more of the picture of the lost pages, what also emerges more fully is not just a picture of the lost pages, but a fuller picture of the Book of Mormon as a whole, how cohesive it is, how fully it's echoing the Bible and telling a new Israelite story of founding a new kingdom of Israel in a new promised land. Thank you.
Could you repeat that?
Go ahead and field questions.
Yeah, questions? Okay.
Have you anticipated that by releasing your book, you've opened the 116 pages to the fan fictioning that tends to happen? That some enterprising prophet is going to take all of your details and dictate the 116 pages?
Yeah,
How
so
much time do you think
that's
it'll-
that's already been attempted, but without knowing about the research. So I would imagine that attempts will be made in light of the research. Thing is, yeah, I would anticipate that. I have a lot of working discoveries, even though, you know, there are 300 pages, 320 pages here of material. I'm still working on more discoveries about what was in the lost pages. And so if somebody is going to write a convincing version of that missing manuscript, they better figure out the other things that I'm working on as well as what I've published. Yeah.
So, years ago, I had a printed copy of the contents of the 116 pages, but I lost it.
Oh.
And if I remember right, it was written by a guy in West Valley City, and the problem with it was when you turned it back into cursive handwriting, it was substantially more than 116 pages. Is that what you're referring to just now? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about one that came out to be more than 116 pages. I know one that comes out to be significantly less. But maybe talk with me after about. I'd be curious to know more. Ghazala.
Yeah, mine's more on the title of your book.
Yeah.
I assume you had the title before you even wrote it.
Because the title has the term the lost 116 pages in it?
Yeah, well, when I was reading it, you said that there's possibly like maybe even as much as 300 pages missing. So did you reconsider retitling your book after you did the research on it?
So I wrote the book already realizing that the lost manuscript was very probably significantly more than 116 pages. The term 116 pages has become, for Latter-day Saints, the name of this manuscript. It's used so often. So an example of this, in that state conference sermon from 1856, when Emer Harris is saying that Martin alone, not counting the other scribes who worked on the lost pages, that Martin alone had scribed for near 200 pages on that manuscript. The state clerk who wrote those notes later went back, it looks like it was later, and added a header to the top of the page so he would remember where this material about the lost manuscript was, and he wrote the phrase 116 pages.
Oh.
So even though the clerk knew that Emer Harris was saying it was longer than 116 pages, he still called it the 116 pages because already that was just the term that Latter-day Saints had to refer to it. And so I used the term lost 116 pages for name recognizability.
And
basically.
how many pages do you think were written with Emma?
How many pages do I think Emma wrote? Her account suggests that she scribed for Joseph across multiple weeks. I actually have come to think that the total period before Martin begins taking dictation was pretty short. So like less than 6 weeks, but she might have scribed for a couple weeks or so, 2 or 3 weeks. So yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the journalist's name that listened to Joseph Smith Sr. And then made the notes and was sort of flippant in his notes about it.
Yeah.
So there was some I've only read that chapter 7 that was in the interpreter.
Okay.
So,
Oh.
but it how did you like pick out what was real and in what he had there? Like how did you confirm it? Did you have what other sources did you draw from?
Yeah.
Will you repeat
okay,
that?
sure. So the question is about the Fayette Latham account of his interview with Joseph Smith Sr. So Fayette Latham was a Palmyra resident, businessman, and he goes and he gets this lengthy recitation from Joseph Sr. about the coming forth verse of the lost pages, and then the contents of, coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and then the contents. His account, as the questioner mentioned, is very flippant. He very much is not a believer. He makes it known in his account that he doesn't believe this narrative that he was told, that the plates are genuine and so on. So the question is how to distinguish like truth from error in that account. So the biggest reason, so I'll say a couple things on that. So the biggest reason that I take the account very seriously is that even though the account isn't published until a good while after the interview, it's published well before many other sources about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon that contain inside information. So for instance, in the 1890s, Joseph Smith's sister Catherine gives an account of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and she says that when the manuscript was stolen, Joseph was told by the angel to pick up the translation where he'd left off. Now, before this account and the Fayette Latham account really were known, scholars were analyzing the Book of Mormon manuscripts, trying to figure out when Joseph Smith lost the manuscript, did he immediately go back and dictate a replacement, the small plates, or did he just pick up where he left off, go to the end of Moroni, and then do the replacement, right? And what the manuscript evidence has recently shown in the Book of Mormon Critical Text Project is he picked up where he left off, and then he did the small plates last. Well, we have only two historical sources that say this. One of them is that account from Joseph's sister in the 1890s. 25 years earlier than that, we have another source saying it, and it's from a Smith family member as well. It's Fayette Latham's Joseph Smith Sr. interview. He says Joseph picked up the translation where he left off. There are a number of details like this that we can confirm from inside sources that were not available at the time Fayette Latham published his account. So the person who's looked into that the most, maybe other than me, I don't know, we might be similar in that way, but like, would be my friend Mark Ashurst McGee with the Joseph Smith papers. Really excellent scholar. So Mark has given a good deal of analysis to Fayette Latham's account, and even from a critical eye, because Fayette Latham says some things that people might question, right? Like about Joseph Smith's treasure digging and so on. And Mark has looked at it very critically, but he's told me he's completely convinced that Fayette Latham not only talked to Joseph Smith Sr., but he had to have made notes at the time, because there's no way he could remember the number of details that we can confirm from sources that were not available when he published his account. Now, how do you sort of sift through fact from fiction? One way that I mentioned in that Passover chapter that uses this account is Latham, there are times when it's just clear that he's garbling, like he seems to have encountered the actual narrative, and so he's saying something where you could see how he could get that from what he was told, but it's not the actual narrative. So the example that I gave earlier, the Liahona, right? He knows that the ball is guiding them. He forms his own mental image of how the ball is guiding them. It's not he didn't figure it out right? So it makes all the sense in the world to posit, well, he's told this narrative, they're guided by this ball, and then he's filling in the blanks, right? He's garbling some of it. There are other parts of that narration where there's no way to derive them from as garblings, right? They don't make sense that way. So the detail that Laban is drunk because of a festival. Well, the extant text doesn't tell us why he was drunk, so there's nothing to garble there, right? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Like, it's just an entirely new detail. Then you compare it to the narrative that we have, and it turns out it really fits. So Laban's not just out carousing that night, right? Yeah. The text tells us Laban was out by night with the elders of the Jews. These are high-profile drinking buddies, right? Like, if that's what he's doing, he's out by night with the elders getting drunk. He's also wearing armor and carrying this elaborate sword, right? And that doesn't sound like going out to drink with your buddies, but like, you know, like a ceremonial occasion.
That's how we do it
better,
anyhow,
right? Yeah. Of course. Another thing that I'll mention is the more I do Mormon history, this may sound funny to say, but the more I do Mormon history, the more respect I have for the sources. The sources are always evidence of something. Sometimes they're not evidence of what we are looking for. Sometimes they're evidence of how someone's memory, how human memory warps across time. Sometimes they're evidence of someone's motives, personal motives, right? The historical sources are always telling us something about the past. And if we read them closely, right, with a detective's eye, we can figure out what it is that they're telling us. So, Jen.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much
Yeah.
for all you're doing. I'm so excited. I'm sure everybody in the room feels the same way. But I was wondering, so you had said in a previous either interview or lecture that Joseph Smith Sr. was led to believe somehow that the lost pages might be found again.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was a little kid and I was told the story like you were about the lost pages, somebody had said, yeah, you know, there's more, it might come out eventually. But I'm just wondering, did Joseph Smith Jr. or anybody else talk about it at all, or was that just something that Fayette Latham recorded from Joseph Smith Sr.?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. So it was brought up that I mentioned in another interview or event that Joseph Smith Sr., in telling Fayette Latham about the lost manuscript, said that that manuscript would resurface, that it would be available again, which I can only hope. This is like prophecy, right? And where does this idea come from? So that's hard to say for sure. It would make sense to me to think that Joseph Smith Sr. might be getting it from Joseph Jr. I don't know. It is possible that it's just Sr.'s own personal inference. I can tell you that it appears that even independent of Section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants and what it says about the manuscript, everybody early on thought that the manuscript still existed. Nobody, the narrative eventually became, it was Lucy Harris in the kitchen with the candlestick, right? Nobody thought that originally. Nobody gives that story till nearly a quarter century after the fact. Early on, even people who thought Lucy Harris was involved thought she had taken the manuscript and hid it or given it to someone else. Nobody thought it was destroyed. So presumably, this easily could be something that Joseph Smith Jr. was telling to Sr. And let's hope, right, that it's out there.
But Joseph Smith Jr. didn't ever comment on it. He kind of let it go and just moved forward.
Yeah, he commented that he didn't know where the manuscript was. In 1838, he mentioned that he had never been able to retrieve it, but he seemed to assume it still existed. Yeah.
I've heard reference that there is a reference either in a Harris estate or divorce order record that references the lost pages. You ever heard of that?
Oh, I've never heard of that. We have a Martin Harris descendant here who could maybe help to dig more into that. Yeah, so the question, if you didn't pick up on the mic, was just that the questioners heard reference to the idea that the lost pages were mentioned in the Martin Harris estate
We're in
papers?
part of the inventory,
Part of
either
the inventory.
of the estate or a divorce decree.
Or of a divorce decree. Okay, interesting. I mean, there was actually never a divorce. However, Martin and Lucy separated around right after the manuscript loss. But was there? Oh, Greg.
Don, could you comment on how your work has impacted your perspective of the truth claims of Mormonism in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. So, how has my work impacted my perspective on the truth claims and my own faith when it comes to Mormonism? So, yeah, I've had a winding, circuitous personal journey. When I started this project 15 years ago, as I mentioned, I did want to really understand the earlier missing part of the Book of Mormon to understand what had happened later. But I was very much a doubter, and in fact, at that point, just basically didn't believe. I had some vacillation in my non-belief, but I didn't believe any longer. I had come to think that Joseph Smith was making up the text, and even came to think a little bit later for a while that Joseph Smith was an opportunist, and that he was not only making the text up, but he was making it up for personal reasons, like self-aggrandizement. And this particular project, this research, played an enormous role in really changing my life trajectory spiritually at that point, because after I'd been doing this project for about 5 years, I started hitting on some of the discoveries that went into chapter 14 about King Mosiah I, King Benjamin's father, his narrative from the Lost Pages. And I was doing intertwining research also actually on Joseph Smith's first vision. So these are the two things, there's a way that they connect. These are the two things that I was directly working on, and I started finding things in that research that just were tremendously compelling to me, where the narrative that I was uncovering was incredibly complex. It was incredibly grounded, like biblically grounded, and was like echoing the biblical narrative in complex and fascinating ways. It was a narrative that anticipated later developments in the Restoration. So specifically what I was looking at was a narrative from Joseph Smith Sr. to Fayette Latham about the Nephite recovery of the Jaredite interpreters. So scholars have mentioned before that our Book of Mormon text tells us the Nephites had the interpreters, but never explains how they got the interpreters. And here Joseph Smith Sr. gave a narrative of how the Nephites got the interpreters. Now Fayette Latham didn't remember names. He never actually read the Book of Mormon. He just knew events that had been narrated to him, not names. We can identify from other clues that this is Mosiah I on his exodus. The narrative said that from Joseph Smith Sr., he was traveling in the New World. They were on an exodus. They were being led by the Liahona. And they had a tabernacle, so like a portable temple, like the Israelites of the Exodus. And this man who's using the Liahona, Mosiah I, he's led by it to an object, and he doesn't know what the object is or what its purpose is, but he carries it into the tabernacle, and there the presence of God, understood to be there behind the veil of the tabernacle, right in the Holy of Holies. The Lord asks him, "What is that in your hand?" And he answered, he did not know, but had come to inquire. And then the Lord told him, "Take the instrument and put it on your face, cover your face with an animal skin, veil your face," and he does, and he can see anything. It's the interpreters. And I had been working on a project looking at how Joseph Smith became a seer. And I posited that the first vision was the origin of Joseph Smith's seership, that this is the explanation of how he can see spiritual things. It's literally his first vision, right? And there was a little-known account from John Alger, Fanny Alger's brother, relating that when Joseph Smith told about the vision, he said at first the Lord touched his eyes with his finger, and then he could see spiritual things, which fits Jesus healing the blind by touching their eyes and other things in the scriptures. So I was looking at scriptural accounts of people becoming seers, and this Lost Book of Mormon narrative of Mosiah I becoming a seer, getting the interpreters, was one of these examples of how somebody becomes a seer in the Mormon cosmos. And what I saw in that narrative was how incredibly temple it was. I had thought before this that Joseph Smith didn't know a thing about the Nauvoo endowment until March 17th, 1842, the day he was initiated as a Freemason. And what I came to see by examining this story and other information accounts of the first vision was that actually temple endowment was written all over this tremendously long before Joseph becomes a Mason. That if you go through that narrative that I just gave of this dialogue through the veil of the temple, and the Lord asks the guy a question about his hand, and then the guy says he does not know but has come to inquire, and then the Lord gives him further information, and I, using other information from Martin Harris, I argue that this culminates in him being brought into the presence of the Lord. It's the same thing that happens to the brother of Jared. He's on a mountaintop, which scripturally is a sort of temple context, right? He speaks with the Lord through the veil, that's what he calls it, right? Metaphysical veil here. The Lord puts his hand through the veil. He asks the man a question about his hand. The man, the Lord tests the man's faith and knowledge with these questions. When the man passes the test, he's admitted into the Lord's presence. He's given a revelation of things that can't be shared with other people, hence he puts them in the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. He's also given these white stones, the interpreters. Well, Revelation 2:17, section 130 of the Doctrine and Covenants, white stone has significance in a temple context. Christ says in Revelation, to him that overcometh, I will give unto him a white stone, in the which is written a new name, which no man knoweth save him that receiveth it. There's, like, temple endowment material had been written all over in the Book of Mormon and in the First Vision and other places, and I just hadn't seen it. And this narrative from Joseph Smith Sr. of Mosiah I becoming a seer was what opened my eyes to that and just, completely blew my mind. And I don't have time to go through all the implications that I saw from this, but it changed my view of Joseph Smith and what he was all about enormously. Ultimately resulted in me not seeing Joseph Smith as an opportunist, but as perfectly religiously sincere, and helped to initiate me reconsidering other things in my life and rejoining the church. I'd had my name removed from the records, and I was rebaptized. So that's part of the impact that this research has had on me.
Okay, one more, and we're gonna have to.
With regard to Lehi's friend Ishmael,
Yeah.
though you rely on a source,
Yeah.
albeit a little garbled, you
Yeah.
seem to go with it. Under what circumstances could you imagine a good Ephraimite family 600 years before Christ naming a son Ishmael?
I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Repeat it, would you?
So the question is, I talk about some of the sources that I talk about from Joseph Smith actually talk about Ishmael's descent, what tribe of Israel he was from. He's from Ephraim, Joseph Smith said, and that was in the Lost Pages. And there's significance to that I lay out. But the question was, under what circumstances might I imagine a good Israelite from the 6th century BC naming their child Ishmael? I don't know. It would be interesting to see how much that name might have been used. Recall that there wasn't the kind of antagonism that there is now. There were no Muslims around. There wasn't a sense maybe of antagonism between descendants of Ishmael and Isaac. And sometimes people are given names both historically and now from the not so great figures of the Bible. So for instance, the Joseph Smith Sr. family, one of their neighbors was Cain Robinson, C-A-I-N. Most of us probably aren't going to name our children after the first murderer, but apparently some people do, right? Yeah.
Okay, I think we better bring it to a close. It's been